Once upon a time, basing a cartoon series on a toy line would be preposterous. But in the early 80s, President Reagan effectively deregulated children's television and it ushered in a new era. The age of the toy-based cartoons. In a bold move, toy company Mattel and Filmation Studios, under the leadership of co-founder Lou Scheimer, gave the world He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. A franchise that by 1984 had reached a peak annual revenue of $400 million. Now that kind of success was bound to draw imitators, and it wasn't long before everyone was getting in on the act. Fast forward to 1987, and the toy maker Hasbro and the animation studio Sunbow achieved a similar success with G.I. Joe and Transformers. But one of their later projects was a short-lived and underappreciated gem by the name of Visionaries, Knights of the Magical Light. The cartoon follows two rival groups who battle for supremacy, using their powers of transforming into various animals. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind back. After hitting a gold mine with G.I. Joe and followed by an even bigger hit with Transformers, Hasbro decided to test their luck with a new IP in humanoids. The series wasn't the surefire hit the creators were hoping for, so they set out to try again with something new. The gimmick this time was holograms. Hasbro created 4 heroes and 4 villains for the toy line. Now, the toys were similar in size to the much popular Action Force G.I. Joe figures, but the animal totems on the characters' chest plates were represented by brilliant holograms. The motifs on the power staffs used 2 image holograms which shifted as you tilted them back and forth. They approached Sunbow to produce the series based on their toys. Sunbow then contracted TMS Entertainment in Japan for the overseas animation work. Now, it is important to keep in mind that at this time there wouldn't be any help coming from the House of Ideas, Marvel. The comic book juggernaut is actually largely responsible for the lore and characters within the Transformers franchise that still exist today. However, Marvel's Star Comics imprint would assist with publishing a bi-monthly comic book series to coincide with the release of the cartoon. To craft the series, Flint Dille and Buzz Dixon were picked for the job. You see, both of them worked on Hasbro's properties in the past, and they both served as story editors under Steve Gerber on G.I. Joe. They would later jump over to Transformers halfway through its second season, where they became the main story editors. Their work would turn the series into a sprawling interplanetary adventure series as an epic history and mythos was built for the denizens of Cybertron. And more importantly, they put the focus on characters, building each machine and the occasional human into distinct personalities. This carried into the mind-blowing animated film and its immediate sequel, Season 3, which took advantage of the jump in time and major cast replacements, to craft for itself a marvelous series about man and machine spreading throughout the stars, sometimes together and sometimes at odds. But then, if you can believe it, Dille and Dixon were taken off the show when they wouldn't bring Optimus Prime back. But they stayed with Sunbow Productions, and with Dille taking the lead and Dixon as his wingman, were given 2 other Hasbro action figure properties they could develop from the ground up. The first, the gleefully twisted Inhumanoids, which only lasted 13 episodes before being cancelled. And the second was Visionaries, Knights of the Magical Light. First, they expanded the cast by introducing the characters of Galadria and Viralina, female knights who were not present in the original toy line. Now, each knight is also linked to their totem in more ways than their personality. Leoric, whose totem is a lion, wields a whip, a common tool of lion tamers. And of course, the first few letters in his name, Leo, are also Latin for lion. Feral is a play on words. Feral is taken from the Latin word fera, meaning wild animal, in his case, the wolf. Now, Witterquick is the fastest, thus he uses a boomerang, which is a fast weapon when thrown. I mean, come on, geeks, are you keeping up? Rekken's sword and armor is scale, like that of the lizard. Mordred's weapon, the scythe, looks like an insect limb, and Viralina's sword looks like a shark's dorsal fin. To bring the characters to life, the show featured an all-star cast with the talents of Peter Cullen, Jim Cummings, Neil Ross, Chris Latta, Susan Blue, Jonathan Harris, and Roscoe Lee Brown. Funny enough, Roscoe, who voiced Merklin, had earlier portrayed the character whose name and image inspired his, Merlin, in Once Upon a Classic, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. All that was left to make was a series of commercials, and with everything in place, the show premiered on September 21st, 1987. The series is set on the planet Prismos, where its 3 blazing suns have recently gone into convergence, an event known as the Cataclysm. This signals the end of the Age of Science and the birth of the Age of Magic. As all their previous technology has gone dead, its people quickly revert into a feudalistic medieval lifestyle. Shortly thereafter, the wizard Merklin announces a challenge. All those who can reach his shrine will be granted powers of transformation as well as other magical powers. I mean, as if the initial offer wasn't enough. There are 2 domains. New Valaric, peaceful under the leadership of the wise and courageous Leoric, and another ruled by the evil and tyrannical Darkstorm, whose singular drive is to overthrow Leoric. Knowing that both parties are always looking to gain a military advantage, a wizard named Merklin approaches first Darkstorm and then Leoric with a promise of enough magical power to defeat their enemies once and for all. Everyone who wishes to gain the usage of magic is invited to a competition by the wizard Merklin. After surviving traps, dangerous creatures, and each other, survivors are rewarded with the unique animal totems affixed to their armor chest plates. And these talismans are based on the bearer's individual attributes while allowing them to transform into their specific creatures. 14 surviving knights are granted with these incredible powers. For the exception of Kravix, who changes into a mythical creature. His totem is the Phylot, a scavenging flying reptile from Prismos. Some knights are given staffs enchanted with various magic powers that are activated by its holder reciting a special verse, and they could be used only once before they needed to be replenished. This kept continuity of the series, but some viewers might find it irritating as they couldn't use their powers all at once. Characters who could not use these weapons instead had the power to infuse vehicles with magical powers, the spells for which were never used in either the comic or the animated series, but instead were printed on the official toy packaging. That is strange, right? I find that strange. Does anyone else you know what? I'll move on. Now, in return for the excellent gifts, Merklin expects the knights to carry out tasks for him, or face the penalty of not being able to recharge their power staffs in his magic pool. The Knights are split into 2 factions, the heroic Spectral Knights and the evil Darkling Lords. And with that begins the rivalry between the 2 factions for dominance. Meanwhile, the first issue of the comic book was an adaptation of the first episode, The Age of Magic Begins. But subsequent issues took the storyline in a different direction with changes from the animated series, such as characters having unlimited use of their power staffs, and with Witterquick and Sindar combining the powers of their staffs together to defeat an enemy in one issue. The animal totems were depicted in their natural forms instead of the 2 factions' representative blue or green. The show followed a typical but proven formula like that of G.I. Joe and Transformers. You had 2 warring groups with an ever-expanding cast of supporting characters. The idea of each Visionary transforming into a different animal is even similar to Transformers, but the inclusion of power staffs as the means of giving Visionaries a secondary power is quite neat. I mean, this was Arthurian legend with a sci-fi twist, or Star Wars set in medieval times. It had medieval-looking castles, it had armor, weapons, damsels in distress. Oh wait, that's just Virulina. But also futuristic vehicles and Mechagodzilla? The intro is a visual treat featuring a catchy theme and cool action sequences. The outro is just the intro song but without vocals and almost more awesome because of it, especially when you see Leoric whip the screen. Admittedly, the heroes are a little stiff. There are a few instances where disagreements arise, but being the upstanding pillars of moral do-goodery, there's no real character development. This doesn't happen often, but the heroes really lack a comedic relief or a point-of-view character. On occasions, we get charmed by Leoric's ridiculous acts of bravery, or Farrell's youthful impulsiveness, or the tender romance between Cryotech and Galadriel, but they don't hold a candle to the villains, the Darkling Lords. Darkstorm, basking in silly displays of his own ego like forcing his citizens into trapdoor games of human chess. Recon, the sly thief who's always working an angle and only fights for the side he does because they pay him to do so.
What will you pay me to rescue you? Nothing compared to what you will pay if you don't stop this thing. There is no profit in resisting.
Kravex, the berserker barbarian whose every line is delivered as a shrieking roar.
Oh, mist-filled pits, dark, dank, unclear, touch all before me with frost-fingered fear!
Lexor, the coward who only fights where there's other people between him and his foes and runs like hell or hides in his armadillo form when he becomes the center of the attention. Viralina, who's so badass she once turned into a shark and swallowed her leader whole. And then there's the boot-licking Mortrid, who desperately tries at every occasion to make his beloved leader Darkstorm proud, no matter the humiliation and sacrifice he himself must endure. Now, Sindar is easily the most interesting character. Despite being on the villain's side, you can sense there is a softer side to him, especially when he stops his destructive rage to save a kitten under the rubble. And this is just a speculation, but you could almost sense he would have turned into a spectral knight if the series had a longevity. Now, the show itself is pretty bare when it comes to the backgrounds, and the coloring of the cartoon can look quite dim. This is arguably a good choice to make your show stand out, but it isn't something that the majority of kids would find exciting. And the Knights had to go against some heavy hitters. That same year saw the launch of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, DuckTales, and not to mention the shows from the creator's own property like Transformers, which already had a sizable following by that point. It was a good quality cartoon that had potential room to expand, interesting characters, and a high standard of sharp animation compared to even some of the more popular 80s cartoons. But seemingly, it just wasn't enough to stop the show from meeting its tragic end. But the bottom line is that Hasbro is a toy-making company. If the toys didn't sell, then that was it. And the cartoon wasn't very popular according to the sales of its toys and viewing figures. Which brings the obvious question, why didn't it sell? The line of toys was fairly small compared to G.I. Joe and Transformers in their first year. By the time the cartoon hit the TV stations across the nation, only 2 small and 2 large vehicles were available to the kids and its 8 action figures. The same ones that were used to kickstart the franchise. So, if you wanted the characters created specifically for the show, you just couldn't have them. Furthermore, just like the years prior where Transformers had to face with a similar concept of GoBots, the Visionaries had to face Supernaturals from Tonka Toys. In fact, Tonka Toys' Supernaturals were available for purchase in April, while Visionaries didn't appear on the shelves until June. It also had to do with the price. Holograms were not cheap. Not to mention that each toy came with not 1, but 2 holograms. And if my math is correct, which it rarely is, that's like 2 times much. This drove the cost much higher than what Transformers and G.I. Joe costed at the time. And thus, they sat there on the shelves collecting dust. And with that final, dusty nail in the coffin, the show ended the same year in December, leaving a lot of unanswered questions like what Wizard Bogovis was really up to, or what was Galadria and Viralina's extra magic power. However, the comic book lasted long enough to reveal that last mystery. Both Galadria and Viralina received shields similar to the Power Staffs, with the abilities of healing.
By warmth of heart your pain I feel, grant me the power your wounds to heal.
And disease.
Wind of sickness, illness most vile, strike down my enemy, with disease rewile.
Now, since there was no incentive to make more comics based on the show that no longer existed and wouldn't be back for a second season, it was cancelled mid-series in September of 1988. Shortly after the series ended, Sunbow lost its financial partnership with toys giant Hasbro. Around 1987, there were so many cartoon toy lines that Sunbow struggled, and even more so when Hasbro left and partnered with the cheaper-produced Deke Animation Company. Both of the companies, Sunbow and Hasbro, were cutting their losses. If the first season was a huge success, there still would have been a chance it would have been scrapped after 1 season. It was a case of bad timing for the Visionaries cartoon to come out in 1987. Any earlier or later, there might have been a second season. But alas, The series didn't have enough magic to make that happen. But what would have happened if the second season went ahead? Well, we actually have an answer for that. Sort of. We know that a second round of characters was intended to be released for the toy line which inspired the show. Some of the characters used shields instead of staffs, which was an idea that would be borrowed from the comics. But it never came to fruition due to the expense and the time needed to make their fragile breastplate and shield holograms. And we never got to see characters like Ramazan, Cyclor, and Hydron, who had a totem of a dolphin, the same totem used by Galadria. You see, by the late 80s, Hasbro seemed to stop making female characters altogether, despite having prominent female characters in most of their shows. Perhaps this stems from Mattel releasing their line of She-Ra toys that didn't sell very well. But unfortunately, whatever the case may be, the characters of Galadria and Viralina were never made. Outside of a few references and parodies, the franchise became a lost relic of pop culture. But over the years, there were minor attempts to bring the franchise back to the public. Most notably around 2009-2010, Abrams Gentile Entertainment Incorporated looked to relaunch the Visionaries brand under the name Visionaries Reborn. But nobody was interested. In 2018, some of the characters appeared in an IDW miniseries comic book called Transformers vs. Visionaries, although they barely resembled the cartoon version. Years later, the fans stumbled into possession of the finished scripts. They included the scenes that were cut for time or altered for the sake of pacing, and on rare occasions, entire characters that were scrapped, like this guy. Here are just a few more notable examples. The giant in the pilot was originally going to be a gargoyle. There is a missing scene that implies that anyone can use their staff as long as they know the words, and there's even a cut scene indicating that Viralina, too, can power vehicles. Geeks, I'm telling you, there is a lot more, but we simply don't have the time to go through each one of them. But you can do it yourself by visiting thevisionaries.net for all the latest findings on the cartoon and the toy line. And all that's left to say is today the series has its small but loyal fan base to thank for truly battling to keep the memory of this show alive. Like and comment if you enjoyed this, geeks. Be sure to subscribe if it's more content you seeks. Check out the links in the description below. And stay awesome, geeks. I've gotta go.